Welcome to this conversation on Genesis, chapters 1 through 24. Margaret Fox and I are delighted to welcome to the Zoom call Anna Carter Florence. Anna is the Peter Marshall Professor of Preaching at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. And she is also the author of, among other books, but also one called A is for Alabaster, 52 Reflections on the Stories of Scripture, which I believe will be available almost any day now, at the very beginning of October. So, and that's, I'll let you maybe talk about that in the course of the conversation, Anna, but as the parts that I've heard from it are these short reflections, but deep reflections on either characters in the Bible or symbols or themes in the Bible, some of which we often tend to steer around on purpose. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you, Matt and Margaret, for asking me to be here. It's really great to be with the two of you. I was very happy to know I would get to spend some time with you. I think one of the things that's been on my mind through all of my work over the years is trying to get people more interested in Scripture and trying to make Scripture feel more accessible, and trying to loosen up the rules, but yeah, other things, loosen us up to enter Scripture in new ways, the way I think we can, and the way you all know that we can. So that's really been the aim of everything that I think I try to do in the end.
Yeah. Excellent. And you're also a former associate pastor at Westminster Presbyterian.
Yes, I am.
Not all of our viewers will remember that necessarily.
Yeah, I was there from 1988 to 1993. So it was my first job out of seminary. And David, my husband, was down the road, down the street at Plymouth Congregational. So we were, yeah.
Yeah. You were ordained right there on
right there,
Mall, so to speak.
I occasionally run into couples that you married.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yep.
There are a lot of weddings at Westminster.
It's true. It's true. I'm the wedding pastor now. So
it's such a great place. Yeah.
Well, we're starting off with, Genesis at the beginning, and particularly those first 24 chapters. Let me just kick us off with a question. So a lot of people are relieved when they find out, I don't have to believe God created the world in 7 24-hour days. I don't have to believe that God flooded the world, with Noah. Some of these stories are mythic, and they're trying to explain origins. But then sometimes that means we don't have to take the story seriously, right? Once we decide, oh, I get it. This is like an ancient culture's way of explaining certain unexplainable things, the fall in the garden and things like that. What's the point of the stories? They're obviously about more than just these clever old stories from an ancient culture, aren't they?
Well, they are old stories from an ancient culture, yeah. And very much rooted in that culture. But I think, sometimes the dualism of our culture and time just really blows my mind. I think, stuff can have truth and not be fact. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how, instead of trying to fit Scripture into our own paradigms of of scientific fact or the ways we approach those kinds of things, truth in itself, wisdom in itself, is such a huge, broad category and so much harder to define. And so for me, what these stories speak into is the truth of what it is to be human, to be creatures created by God, and what it means to live together. And that some of those great themes are explored in literature all through the ages, and for people of faith in a particular way with this book. So for me, that I can use words like inspired when I think about that, because it feels to me like a book we just read in a different way. We're not trying to prove it. We're not trying to hit anybody over the head with it. We're not trying to weaponize it, which are things that are happening all over the culture, right? So one thing that I know Westminster does really well, and I hope that you all will continue to do with this series, is to give people different ways, liberative ways to read this book and to search for truth in it without having to be embarrassed by it, or without having to apologize for it, or without having to get mired down in, 7 days. I mean, poetry, I read a lot of poetry, and poetry is sort of in the same genre, right? So it's for me. So that's why I haven't spent a lot of time getting snagged by those things. But I understand why people do, because we have a lot of good examples out in the culture of churches that do just that and are pretty intolerant of others who don't. Whoops, I've lost you, Matt.
Matt, I can't hear you.
Volume.
Sorry, what draws you into some of those older stories in Genesis, some of those earlier stories? Like what should people look for, I guess?
I teach a class at the seminary that has made me read stories that I wouldn't otherwise read. And that's been a really interesting discipline, because otherwise I might cherry pick around. But in this particular class, we read a different book of scripture every spring. And the point of the class is we get together on Monday nights or whenever it meets for 3 hours, and we read through the book. We did Genesis one year. Obviously, you can't read through Genesis all in one night. But we worked our way through this, the stuff that we liked, the stuff that we didn't like. And we did it in sequence, not having to stop and talk about it all the way through, but just to let the words come over us. And in the process of doing that, I found myself getting drawn to particular stories that I think I would have ignored or overlooked or given myself permission to walk around. So I think the stories I'm drawn to, some of it has to do with the disciplines I bring to reading. Like if I hadn't given myself the structure with these students of reading through the book of Genesis, there would have been a lot that I missed, and consequently a lot about Genesis that I didn't receive, in as deep a way from having had to do that thing. I guess, have you all run marathons? I think this is why people train for marathons. Yeah. I mean, there's a sense of training to do this thing because that it's different than running 26 miles on 26 days, 1 mile at a time. There's something about doing that whole thing. Anyway, that's one metaphor that might resonate in some ways.
So in a marathon is also, it's not just something you do all at once, but it's something that you do with others, right? You're in this big pack of runners. And I'm curious, what can you give an example of something that in going through Genesis in this sort of sustained endurance way with your students that you picked up or that struck you differently in reading it in that setting?
Thank you for that question, Margaret. And thank you for the insight about marathons doing it together. Well, I'll say a couple of things. One is I've been doing this class for over 10 years. And the year we read Genesis was 2019. And if you look back, there were a lot of immigration issues happening at that point. And I had just finished reading Kathleen O'Connor, who was a retired Old Testament professor at Columbia, her new commentary on Genesis, in which she was reading it through the lens of trauma theory as a book for essentially refugees. Mm. Her whole theory for the book of Genesis is that it is a book that was written at a time when the people, when Israel was convinced after the deportation to Babylon that there was nothing left, no future for them at all. And so they were dried up, they were cut off. And the book of Genesis is supposed to help them reimagine for themselves a theology of beginnings, that there is a new way of being created, that the God who created everything, the universe, is recreating them now. But the book does so, and this is how she reads it through the lens of trauma theory, by kind of refracting the truth that they've experienced, these horrific traumatic things they've experienced, the horrible violence and death and starvation that happened in Jerusalem, and then all these years of enslavement. So O'Connor says the way Genesis does this is by showing us kind of disaster stories that are meant to be stories of being wiped out, like the flood, Noah and the flood, and then showing how God can bring about beginnings even in such a thing. And the point, O'Connor says, is to help us, because people who've been through trauma can't always talk about their own trauma, is to help us focus on something else out there. Okay, this is a long answer to your question. So we were reading the book of Genesis in 2019 through this lens at a time when the refugee situation was very, well, it's always acute, but it was really politicized. And we kept asking ourselves through the reading, what is it like to hear this as a displaced person? And so we did a lot of a reading of other things. I mean, from Hannah Arendt's classic essay, the great theorist Hannah Arendt, on what it is to be a refugee that she wrote after World War II, and new films that are out now about the refugee situations worldwide and migrating peoples worldwide. And the story spoke to us in a really different way. So I guess what I would like to say is, when you bring a particular lens to your reading of the whole, it helps you hear stories that you wouldn't have thought really mattered, or you might have just thought were for children, like Noah. And to hear them again in a kind of profound key of helping us learn something about who we are as human beings, when we can't always talk about the things that are most painful to us in the moment. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to, yeah. She says it far better than I, so I really recommend her commentary to you all.
Kathleen O'Connor.
Yeah, I mean, this one, it's Smythe and Helwis, and it was written so that college students could be able to pick it up. So it's quite accessible.
Yeah.
We're keeping a list. We might add that one to our resources guide. Right. Yeah.
So then what does that, I like that idea of asking the question, how does a displaced person read this and understand this? What happens when some of these stories have so much baggage attached to them from other times and places? I sometimes talk about the afterlife of a text, like how has it been used? So there are stories, like, I don't think you can read Genesis 2 and the ordering of creation without thinking about, questions of like male dominance in the household, this idea of, well, the man was created first, therefore, which I'm not so sure that the Genesis 2 story is placing a strong accent on that, but other biblical texts do, and certainly other biblical teachers have. So is there a way we can kind of shed some of that tradition or some of that afterlife, or do we just have to steer through it?
Yeah, I love your use of that phrase. And it reminds me of Yvonne Sherwood, who's, biblical scholar. She has this wonderful book on Jonah, a biblical text and its afterlives. And one of the ways she starts the book, which, and I've used her book with students too, is she starts by saying, okay, let's look at the 4 big ways this text has been interpreted. And she just sort of lines them out. And when she does that, it's using the history of interpretation, right? It helps us see how we've fallen into broad categories without judging, but just saying, through time, and particularly since the Christian church has been around, this is how we have tended to read this particular text. And this is why we've done that. And then once we've named that, it's like you've been to therapy and you can now say, it's out here, and now we can come at it afresh. this class that I teach, one of the other disciplines we have, besides reading through a whole book of scripture, is that we have to perform it at the end of the semester. So we have to find a way for it to speak into the community where we are now, given everything that we've read, everything that we've learned by speaking the words every week. And we also give ourselves the freedom and the creativity to kind of just create something we're going to do once and never do again. And I say that because I think that's been permission giving for us to kind of leave behind this sense that we have to write a definitive word. We have to produce something that's going to be out there forever. We're going to, as a community, read this text, own that, claim that, not claim any more than that, offer it to our own community, which is kind of what preaching is, right? Without claiming more than that, and then see what happens in that conversation. So I have found that kind of bracketing things sometimes through a lens of creativity, of saying, we're going to actually create something, and it gives people the freedom to think in a different key.
What did you use for the Babel
think, this is where I'm sure your class is going to be amazing for the two of you, because you're going to lay out what those mainstream interpretations have been, and people can see, Sorry, I interrupted. You were about to say something.
No, I was going to ask you how you reenacted the Babel Tower. Oh,
well, we just sort of told that one because it's one of the disaster stories. Yeah. We had this, the setup was that we were this group sitting in the middle of somewhere on the road to somewhere and recalling the stories. And sometimes we would just talk about them as things that had happened. And then sometimes we would leave that, and there would be a scene in which we'd reenact kind of the four, we sort of focused on the four matriarchal cycles, of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebecca and Jacob and Leah and Rachel, and then Joseph and the brothers. So that's how we did that. And at the time, Margaret, what I remember is we were imagining that we had been through something equally as significant as the collapse of that enormous tower and all that it represented. And so in telling this story that was from our past, we were giving the characters that we were being right then kind of permission to think about not only that these are things that have happened, but that God somehow was present later in ways that we didn't know. We weren't trying to whitewash it, but it just, yeah.
I can see that with stories like, Babel, with the curse of Ham, after Noah falls down drunk, which is a passage that's been the source of all sorts of evil and mischief and how it's been interpreted. Even Sodom and Gomorrah, some of these, but even some of the individual things, Abraham trafficking his wife, that there it's kind of, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but is that maybe a story then of what did desperate people do to survive? What horrible choices do they make? And then not learn from, right? Yeah. He repeats it. It becomes in some ways embedded in the family system. Not to excuse Abraham, but perhaps to think back about what trauma does to not just a nation, but to individuals. Am I on the right track here? Am I?
I don't think there's anything off limits. We did end up pretty quickly in that class. And it was because of our experience of reading the book and feeling where the weight of the book was lying with us. We really focused on those four families. The sort of the chapters 1 through 11, the prehistory, they call it in Genesis, the sort of mythological origins of the world and all of these things. Pretty quickly by chapter 12 in Genesis, you get into the nitty-gritty of family life and 4 particular generations. And what became significant, I think, for me, I'll speak now for myself, is I come from a family that has told some stories, but not all stories. And some of that you don't learn until life goes on, and then things happen, things emerge. And there is something about reading Abraham's story in full, not just the individual chapters, but from the time that he and Sarah agree to do this thing, to leave the place where they've been and then to go somewhere they don't know where, and then to read it, all of the things that happen along the way, and then to follow that with the next generation and see how things are repeating, and what things people have learned and what they haven't learned, and what's been passed down and what hasn't been passed down, and what God is still sort of trying to say, y'all still need to work on this. And then the next generation rises up. The 4 generations in proximity, it just felt like a real family saga that we could understand. And the things that family does to each other within the family, we might not have specific stories that would match that. I mean, nobody went and sold, nobody in my family went and sold, go back 200 years. And yeah, I do have family members who were white slaveholding enslavers, The point is, you don't have to go back very far to find, if not the exact thing that's happening in the story, Abraham trying to pass Sarah off as not his wife, but you find very similar things, far more than we would like to think. And so it doesn't begin to feel so ancient, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And there's something about the sweep of it and the sense that God is still kind of talking to everybody in the middle of it and trying to bring this vision of something bigger than who they've been able to be. I don't know if that's responding to what you're asking, but that kind of helped me to not get snagged down in individual moments in the story where there are just these kind of almost nonsensical things that are happening or crazy things that are happening. But truthfully, I don't have to scratch that far in my own family history to see crazy things.
Well, it's a shift about what Genesis is about, right? You're taking it away from being kind of the authorized national story, which nobody can ever question, about these strange archetypal people, to being something that might look a lot more familiar.
And if we think about, if the point of the book really is to offer us a theology of beginnings, I think that's something that every generation yearns for, is to believe that the God who could create everything, could recreate even us now into something more than what we have believed ourselves capable of being, or believed ourselves worthy of being, or believed it was possible to be.
We have time for one more question or comment, Margaret.
Sure. Yeah, no, I was going to say, I'm really resonating with that, Anna, and just thinking about this sort of theology of beginnings. And it's not exactly a theology of return to some idyllic past, right? Because pretty much as soon as you're out of Eden, which isn't really even a family story, there's no children yet in Eden, as soon as family life begins, it's not an idyllic situation. It is this sort of looking back to understand the patterns, but also looking forward for something new and different to kind of emerge, for something, for God to do something different, or for people to try a different way of being together. You would think there would be a kind of nostalgia in Genesis, but it's not that rosy picture of back in the good old days. I really like the way that you put this in kind of a forward-looking dimension.
Well, that's I like the way you've said that. I really do. And that is, I mean, there are people in Matt's line of work who spend their lives really immersed in these texts, who will say that they really think, Genesis scholars, some say that really the story of Jacob is the heart of the whole book. You know, and so we read about this central character. There's some who think that. And then a lot who think that the kind of climax of the book happens in the last chapter, in the 50th chapter with Joseph. You know, we're sort of building up to this moment. And something that meant a lot to my students and I when we did this course, and that's meant a lot to me, is to also remind ourselves that the way things are translated has handed down for us certain ways of appropriating these texts or ascribing meaning to them. And sometimes we just have to go back and look at another translation and see if it might be different. And the big verse, Matt knows where I'm going with this, is in Joseph at the very end, when he says to his brothers, they come to him, there's the scene, I know you all are going to spend time on this, where they say, okay, our father Jacob is dead. He's just died. They're all back in Egypt. What if Joseph what if he doesn't keep his promise? What if he wants retribution, which would be perfectly understandable? They go to him basically asking, are you going to harm us because of the history that we have and the harm we did to you? And he says, this is how it's the most often translated, and even in the NRSV and NRSV updated edition, is, what you meant it for good, for evil, but God meant it for good, which has always driven me crazy. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That gets so reappropriated in awful ways. But Everett Fox, who's one translator, has translated it differently, and it's been picked up by others as well. And he changes the word meant to the word planned. You planned evil against me, but God planned it over for good. And somehow that little shift, it's what made me think of it, Margaret, is the forward-thinking part. Yeah, there has been evil. We have meant evil. We have meant things for, we've planned it, human beings. We can't claim that God planned it, that it would always go this way, this sort of, at least I can't say that theologically. But the thought that God can plan things over, maybe even in concert with us, is a profound thing for me to think about and reflect on as a person of faith, how I want to be involved in that.